I'm Bryce Futch,
I'm Spencer Amaral.
and this is The Way Forward. Well, welcome back to a new episode of The Way Forward podcast. Spencer and I are sitting on the front porch enjoying a wonderful afternoon cigar, so there is some neighborhood noise in the background. Please excuse that, but it's good to be back with you again. Today we're going to be talking on foreign policy and foreign intervention and talking about what that should look like versus what it does look like without being too in the weeds. That's the goal. It's a big goal, but I'm excited for us. I think we can tackle it.
Was that a pun because there's lawnmowers and yard work going on in the background?
I wish I could say I was that smart, but I just kind of tripped and fell into that one.
That's good.
Yes. So why don't we kind of frame our discussion around specifically military intervention, and because I think we talked a good bit about U.S. aid in the previous season. So let's talk about military intervention and what that should look like and kind of get into that a bit. So do you want to start us off by talking a little just war theory, kind of give us an overview of what that argument means and where it came from and that sort of thing?
Sure. Pleasure to be here with you, Bryce.
As always.
As always. I think we've touched on just war theory a bit in the past, but to recap, it's actually a little more to us, I think, common sense. It's not really a scary, weedy, minutia thing. It's the general sense that there is such a thing as a just fight and an unjust fight, a just war and an unjust war. This is significant because a lot of people think it might be more intuitive for Christians to be pacifists. But the interesting thing is that when you go back into the history of the church, even though you see a whole lot of self-sacrifice in the example of Christ, you see a whole lot of willfully submitting to the powers that be, even in the face of injustice, in the instances of the martyrs in the early church in Rome. People voluntarily walking into death, picking up their cross, following their brothers into the arena, being torn to pieces by the lions. This might create a picture in our minds that, Christians just don't know what it is to ever fight back. But that's not the case at all. And a very strong articulation of a Christian approach to warfare comes through St. Augustine, most especially, who oftentimes is credited with this idea of just war theory and the articulation in the Christian tradition. But the general idea behind just war theory is that, of course, states, nations are instituted by God. Now, this is key, right? Because it's not just that, violence is in the realm of human kingdoms. Human kingdoms are automatically in the realm of fallen humanity. Everything the governments do, therefore, is tainted and dark, right? Mm-hmm. You could easily go down that road, but that's not the biblical understanding of government, actually. The biblical understanding of government is that all authority ultimately is derived from God, who is sovereign over the universe. And he has, in fact, according to Paul, established governments, and all rulers that bear any authority whatsoever can only fall back on the authority of God as the proper founding and source of their authority. And it's funny because even, Cicero and the Romans, they get this. Cicero talks a lot about natural law theory and natural law concepts of justice in Rome, and he's a pagan, right?
Right.
But even he is able to gather the weight of this idea that if I'm just, the biggest guy in town, and I say I'm in charge now, and whatever I say is law, that doesn't endear you to the hearts of your countrymen.
Right. Absolutely.
Nearly as much as if you say, I actually have the well-being of my fellow citizens and the society around me at heart. Right. There's a deeper good that I seek to serve, right? Yeah. There's a higher level of justice.
Right. And it's not a patronizing, I have your good in mind, I know what's best for you. But I'm working through a book right now by Hadley Arkes. I've never heard him pronounce his last name, so I don't know how it is. It's Arkes. But it's called Mere Natural Law, and it's really good. Highly recommend it to you. But it's in it. He talks about the idea of our First Amendment right to free speech does not exist because it's in the Constitution. The Constitution, even in the preamble, makes it very clear that these rights pre-existed. Right? There is a natural law that is ingrained in humans. We agree with the Constitution that it's that we're endowed by our Creator. We believe that these things are inherent and objectively true all of the time. So, yeah, I think that's a really great point to make, that these things are seen and known not just in Christianity, but objectively throughout history and throughout the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is one of the treasures of the history of the church, Christian thought, something being the idea of natural law as a way to encounter and approach creation and the correspondence between what we are talking about with justice, in a biblical sense, and also, the law that is even perceivable to non-believers, as Paul recognizes as clearly the case.
Nature stuff.
And then there's, not to go too far afield, but like there's the fact that we are now at what I would see as like a civilization kind of shift. We Post-modernity represents kind of the end of the modern Enlightenment era as we knew it, and it's kind of taking us back. And there's a lot that's terrible about post-modernity, but one of the few bright points about it is that it's resetting us back to something that might be, hopefully, is going to be closer to the classical approach to faith and reason, right? Being natural law as an understanding that whenever we talk about these concepts of justice, they're deeply embedded in the fabric of existence and creation itself. They bear the fingerprints of God, its maker. They bear the purpose of God in their function. And so we've lost sight of that in the modern era, tragically. And even a lot of Christians are prone to falling into the modern trap of talking about justice as though it is merely a human construct.
Right.
Because, you're faced with a world that we are tempted by our culture to write off as merely, a random lump of cells, right? A random lump of clay. Right. And then we're here to form it and mold it as we would like. And that is not the biblical approach whatsoever, or the historic Christian approach.
Yeah, and critical theory really kind of flips the script on that, right? It takes the might makes right and turns it on its head and says, well, the more you have been oppressed, or the more you think you're oppressed, the more power you actually should have. And that's a wrong reaction to it. It is an incorrect reaction to the might makes right argument.
Right.
Which is why I think the just war theory and a true biblical view of justice is that middle way, right? It's that government is created to hold and restrain evil and to punish evildoers so that what's good, true, and beautiful can flourish and grow, right?
Right.
So let's get back to the war piece of it and the intervention piece of it. So the end goal of warfare is violence, right? It's to exact violence on the enemy, whether they're a combatant or a non-combatant. Now, just war theory would say non-combatants are off limits, but the purpose of warfare is to exact that violence, right? So in the past, we've had armies that would have to line up against each other, and they would fight, and the army that's defending is physically a defense, a barrier between violence and their citizens, their non-combatants. Now with the jet age and with missiles and cyber warfare and terrorism and all of that stuff, we've removed that front line of conflict, and it's all about exacting violence on the non-combatants, right? Because that's how you, at least in our current terroristic world in which we live, that's the goal, because the non-combatants then start to fear. It was kind of the end goal of the Blitz, right? During the Second World War, it was meant to instill fear in Britons. It was meant to tear down their strength of mind and to weaken their resolve, and it ended up having the exact opposite effect. Malcolm Gladwell actually talks about this in one of his books. I don't remember which one, but the fact that a near miss is actually an incredibly powerful tool to strengthen someone's resolve. That the bombing raids in London actually probably did more to win the war for Great Britain than they did to weaken England. So, which is a fascinating perspective to take. It is. But anyway, so the purpose of this is kind of the context in which we're discussing this. In the news this week, obviously Israel and Gaza have been at it for quite a while now, and the Hamas just killed, I believe it was 6 hostages, one of which was an American citizen. And there's been a real lack of a strong reaction from this current administration, and there's not been a clear path forward on how the U.S. should be dealing with these things. Increasingly, we're seeing Russia kidnap American citizens by putting them in jail and holding them at ransom. And that ransom is either payment. Normally, it's a prisoner exchange in which we give up some horrific war criminal for a WNBA player. And so we tend to get the quote short end of the stick on this. So we see a continual growth in these other countries, these other powers taking advantage of the United States by either harming our citizens, kidnapping our citizens, holding our people at hostage or at bay, and trying to get a foreign policy win from the U.S. by manipulating our citizens, right? So the goal of this is to talk about what is the right response from the U.S. for these things. Are you familiar much with the way the Romans viewed this and kind of the context in which Paul used his citizenship to get to Rome? Would you want to share a little bit of that story?
I think I know
where I'm going.
I think, but you go ahead. Yeah, lay that
so
out.
So Rome, the Romans were very well known that if you were a citizen of Rome and harm was to come to you in another country, the Romans would come and hunt you down, and they would basically wipe out your country or wipe out your city. And seek revenge for this harm that came to their citizen. And because of that, there was a very strong understanding that if you were a Roman citizen, you were not to be messed with. And Paul was arrested, and his arresters did not know that he was a Roman citizen. He had been there in jail for quite a while, and then he revealed to them that he was actually a citizen of Rome. And then they basically bent over backwards, apologized, whatever, and then he appealed to Rome. And so his arresters actually paid for and financed and logistically supported his missionary journey to Rome because they sent him there as a prisoner. And that story is incredible. So if you're not familiar with it, highly recommend it to you. But the idea is that a strong superpower, and I would argue that the United States is a superpower, but does not understand how to act like one. We're a very young country. We don't understand the responsibility that being a superpower is. We don't have that type of fear. I can't walk into, some free country in the Middle East and not be targeted by Iran because I'm a U.S. citizen. But in my opinion, that's the way it should be, right? I shouldn't be at a greater risk of being kidnapped overseas and taken prisoner. I should be at a lower risk because of my government standing.
Do you think that's not that way? Because oftentimes
No, not at all.
Well, I can think anecdotally of friends of mine who do speak of going to other countries and the way in which, when they're in any kind of bureaucratic bind, when they present a U.S. passport, it's received with a certain level of significance by the powers that be there.
I think it depends on the country. I think it's...
And I think there's an optimism about... I do come from a country that's well known around the world, and there should be a level of protection that comes with that.
Sure.
So I agree with you in spirit, and maybe the optimism that my friends had in their travels was not, duly founded, but
yeah, I would like to know what
it should absolutely be that way.
It should be. I think it'd be interesting to know which countries they were in. I think if we have good diplomatic relationships with those countries, then they're fine, right? They work well with us. We work well with them. You're not really in any danger unless you actually break their law.
It's just been exposed a bit lately because of the high-profile hostage cases, especially in Russia,
right?
Where they take our people, probably because they're Americans,
absolutely,
and then they toy with us and ask for war criminals back. Yeah.
Correct. That's 100% what happens, and there's no retribution for that. The old adage used to be we don't negotiate with terrorists, right? But that's exactly what we're doing now. We absolutely negotiate with them. And there needs to be a strong response. Now, the old joke is that Democrats want a small army and they want to send them all over the world, and Republicans want a large army and they don't want to send them anywhere. And I think there's a middle ground there. I think with the increase in technology, whether it's through a drone program or through cyber warfare, etc., there are ways to strike these people where it hurts, and to show them that we're not to be messed with, and that we are not to be trifled with, and that a U.S. citizen is not a hostage in waiting. And we lack that American resolve, right? I think especially our current administration hasn't shown any of that. There's been no, look, we're not going to negotiate with you on this. This is obviously not a fair trade. You took a normal average U.S. American citizen on trumped up charges, and now you're expecting us to give you a war criminal back. And we're not going to do that. We're not going to play that game. and we have seen nothing from the administration on any of this. So, from a just war perspective, do you see military intervention in this way as checking those boxes, or do you see this as an infraction there?
Well, to close the loop on defining just war, the goal of just war theory is always trying to do a little bit of math, actually, and say, how do we save the most amount of life possible? How do we protect life? How do you protect your society, your people from an aggressor? Is the question. And see, so a lot of this, like I said before, it's pretty intuitive to people. Mm-hmm. You're not trying to pick a fight. You're trying to actually protect the people around you and prevent unnecessary bloodshed. Now, the only sticky part of this comes in with, like, how you do the calculus with, because in Augustine's mind, you ought not, by just war rubric, get into a war that you think you can't win.
Right.
Because then that would result in avoidable bloodshed,
mm-hmm.
which would then be on your hands. And then the question is, well, even if we're outnumbered and outgunned, if with enough resolve, could we win?
Sure.
Right. And so
and that's
anyway,
the American story. Right?
I know.
Yeah.
I know. And so that's where there's room for debate.
Sure.
There, because you do see, the odds overcome
right.
from time to time. I mean, look at the story of God's people in the Promised Land and the conquest there, and all the odds they encountered. So. In this instance, in how America does foreign policy, there's also the layer of intervention. And so could you restate the question?
Yeah, so for a military intervention, so let's go back to the Hamas example, right? So Hamas takes this American hostage. My thought is there should have been an immediate military reaction to Americans being taken hostage in the first place, right? We failed there. And then once this hostage is killed, if I was in this seat, I would say, look, Israel, give me five Hamas targets. Give me 5 of them. I'm going to send American planes, or I'm going to send American missiles, and we're going to wipe those 5 targets off the map. And then there's a very strong statement. Look, you do not do this to American citizens. We don't want to fight with you. We're not going to come over here and pick a fight. But if you antagonize us, if you threaten one of ours, we're going to come after you, and we're going to come after you hard. So does that check the just war box, is the question.
To save the life of the hostage should be the highest priority, right?
Yep.
You're talking about literally intervening to protect the defenseless, especially in an instance of terrorism like this. This was not a soldier that was captured.
Right.
This was a citizen that does have a U.S. citizenship, taken hostage and being used for extortion, basically.
Right.
It's international extortion. And how you respond to that matters. Now, there's always, in all things foreign policy, there's the aspect of principle, but then there's also the matter of practicality. Just like if you're an FBI hostage negotiator, right? You have to think through this on so many levels to ensure that the person that you're trying to save doesn't actually, get shot because you came in too brazenly into the situation.
Sure.
So there has to be room for reacting practically in a way that gets the job done. But what is it that you're trying to get done? You're trying to protect your people. And I think that gets lost when governments like the current administration seem to be more interested in playing the PR game.
Right.
Rather than simply saying, my priority here is the American citizen whose life is on the line. So I just want to say it's never as clear-cut as we would like it to be in a fallen world.
Spoken like a true Anglican priest.
Dealing with such fallen actors.
Yeah.
Right? But what's the bright line? Mm-hmm. And the thing that you owe when you take your oath to the Constitution to protect the flag, you're really talking about protecting the people. We the people, at the end of the day. So that has to be the consistent thread. And if nothing else, governments should be skewered by their own citizens.
Absolutely.
When they're caught playing the PR game.
Yep.
And covering their butts and wanting to look a certain way. And even wanting to look in such a way like, well, I don't want to attract a lot of blowback because we, sent a SEAL team in to go and grab an American citizen here because that looks like intervening in a foreign war that a lot of people feel very strongly about, and there's division in our society about. the unifying part of this should be the fact that there's a fellow American
Right.
who's in danger, who needs help.
Yes.
And you see, we just had both conventions for the Republicans and the Democrats. Both conventions featured parents of hostages speaking and crying out about the need for help for fellow Americans, as well as innocent people
Right.
caught up in this hell. And it seems like we lose sight of what ought to be the priority, and that is the souls involved of the people that we claim as fellow citizens.
Right.
Not just the 3D international chess going on, which is tough, granted, but we should always be quick to call out our elected representatives when they're not doing their most fundamental job, which is protecting Americans.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
that goes back to what you brought up with the Roman Empire before.
Right.
If there's any kind of a PR game to be played here, it's in our government establishing a clear
Dominance.
certainty in
Yeah.
the minds of everyone around
It's
the
deterrence,
world
right?
that we actually care for our fellow citizens.
Right.
We actually love our people, and we take our oath seriously, and we will uphold it. Don't get between me and my oath.
Right.
In that way.
Yeah, it's definitely 100% deterrence, and so nuclear deterrence specifically, it kind of, you play the chess game with the nukes because you believe that the other person is serious about doing it, right? Which is one of the reasons why I think NATO is now fundamentally flawed, because nobody believes that our U.S. nuclear shield is going to be employed to prevent an invasion of Turkey, right? We're not gonna launch a nuke because Turkey got invaded. That's another discussion for another day. But there's the deterrence factor is there because you truly believe the other person will actually pull the trigger and do it. And we don't have any kind of serious deterrence on U.S. hostages being taken. Right? There's been no real reply and response from this administration or from any of the past administrations. I mean, I think Trump administration did a great job of negotiating well, but there wasn't any kind of real military blowback. At least not that was seen. Now, there's a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes that we don't see and that we don't hear about. But at some point, the PR game has to be you're asserting your dominance. You are the big kid on the block. And with that, your citizens have rights, and they have international rights. So I think that's really good. Now, let's kind of transition away from the hostage-taking piece to supporting foreign wars, right? So we have the war in Ukraine. Now there's this war in Gaza. We were in Afghanistan for 20 years. We were in Iraq as well. Let's talk about taking this just war theory and kind of applying it in these other scenarios. And what does a U.S. response look like, right? Because if you go back to the founders, what was one of the main points that George Washington left with us when he was leaving office was avoid the two-party system and avoid foreign entanglements. And we have mocked both of those pieces of advice to our detriment. But so, it's as a superpower, we do have an international responsibility. However, that doesn't mean we send U.S. troops into combat every time that there's conflict anywhere around the world, right? So,
well, you just can't.
You can't. It's not physically possible. It's not logistically possible. And it's not a right use of resources, right? It's not a correct understanding of the responsibility of our citizens to bear that weight for every country in existence.
Well, this is another area where you have to be able to balance with wisdom and discretion the practical and the principled.
Right.
Because a lot of people would say, if you get involved in one place, then you have to get involved in every place.
Right.
Principally speaking, and that's untenable as an idea.
Just not true.
It's not realistic. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to never get involved either. But again, what should be the unifying principle here? It should be very clear. We're looking out for the interests of our people that I've made an oath to uphold and protect.
Right.
So that should always be clear. It's not a matter of, I didn't take an oath to be principally perfect on, in terms of some abstract ideal. Now, hopefully, upholding good principles helps me to do my job better,
right?
Which is uphold the Constitution and protect the people, which I've sworn to protect. So it's a matter of being realistic about how we do all those things well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard. We should never pretend any of this is very simple, but we do have to be crystal clear on what we're willing to fight and die for.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really good. the current debate with the America First policy. America First doesn't mean America only, right? It's simply prioritizing who are we helping the most and who are we helping most effectively. So take Ukraine and Russia, for example, right? Americans benefit by a weakened Russia. It helps U.S. energy exports. It helps U.S. food exports. It helps create a more stable Europe because Russia is weakened and not able to have these incursions in other states and other countries like Ukraine. So having this conflict theory is a net positive for Americans. However, that doesn't mean we need to continue to send them a blank check of money every time they ask for it, right? We can support it well with munitions. We can support it well with logistical help. We can support it well by bringing other NATO allies to the table to provide help. But it doesn't mean that it is our responsibility alone to bear that financial cost of a Ukraine and Russia. Now,
well, just war theory there would say, do we try to instigate conflict around the world because it benefits American industry? No.
Right.
We would be looking out for the interests of how do we preserve life?
Right.
How do we uphold peace and promote peace? How do we prevent the unnecessary loss of life around the world as well?
Sure. And most of that is done diplomatically, right? It's a
Yes.
strong diplomatic core. It's having that deterrent threat. But the problem with deterrence is every once in a while you have to actually do what you say. And that's where it gets sticky. However, again, with Russia and Ukraine, it's not that we're instigating this. Like, we want to see peace. We want to see peace quickly.
Right. We didn't create this.
Right.
It already happened. So then the question is, how do you react to it?
Correct. Yeah. The same thing I think was true with Iraq and Afghanistan, right? So I think we touched on this a little bit in the last season too, but we went into these countries originally with the idea, we went into Afghanistan with the idea of finding the terrorists that plotted, planned, executed 9/11. And we did that very quickly. We went in, we weakened Al Qaeda, and we killed a lot of people, a lot of bad people, and mission accomplished. Well,
Yeah.
But then we had mission creep, and we said, okay, well, actually, we want to create a stable democracy in a country that's never seen democracy before, has no understanding of a Western worldview that leads to democracy. And so that just isn't tenable. It's non-functional. That's not the way people work and learn and understand and grow. It's the idea that every person is basically good. Every person basically desires freedom and wants democracy, and that's not true, right? It's culturally not true. It's historically untrue. So the option we had was either stick to the original mission, which was get in, kill the terrorists, and get out, which is, in my opinion, is what should have happened. Or we say, welcome to the United States of Afghanistan, and we're there for 40, 50, 60 years, just like the Brits were in India. And we educate, we bring a Western education and a Western worldview to their children, to their children's children. And then we potentially will see a stable democracy. India is kind of on the ropes right now. They are a democracy. They're rapidly growing. They're more on the unstable side than the stable side. So there's some real issues there. So again, that's not a perfect plan by any stretch of the imagination. Not one that I would advocate for. But we'd lose that in our desire to do good. We end up making a much bigger mess of things, right? Like in Iraq, did Saddam have these horrific practices against his own people? Yes. Was he a brutal dictator? Yes. Did he have actual chemical biological weapons of mass destruction? Probably not. So there wasn't a real reason for going into Iraq like we did. We went in there trying to nation build when in reality that wasn't required or called for. So I think we have to look at our intervention in what is best for America first, and then what is best for the others. Because our first duty is to our neighbor. Our first duty is to our countrymen.
It's also a matter of what can you actually control.
Correct.
And affect. If there's a big difference between being a good father, a good mother in your own household, taking a firm stance in your kids' lives, teaching them right and wrong, guiding them, shepherding them along the way. That's called love. Mm-hmm. But if you start treating yourself like the unofficial sheriff of your neighborhood,
right,
and running around and trying to nation build or neighborhood build in
that
way,
right,
very different connotation. So there's just acknowledging, and this goes back to the view of, the institutions that exist and governments and the authorities that exist, we trust God has established them. They derive all of their just authority by, derived from God.
Yeah.
And the human problem is that we continually take the power given to us, the influence that we wield, and we use it incorrectly. We use it for our own good, our own agendas.
Mm-hmm.
And things get messy. Nation building doesn't work when the power that you've created for the common man is misused.
Correct.
Anybody can misuse power, whether you're a king or a subject. And so democracy, you spoke a moment ago about, is it enough to merely try to multiply democracies around the world? Well, it depends on what the heart of that society is. You can try to build a nation, but if you don't have a requisite soul of the nation that can handle that power justly, then you'll just have a different form of government perpetrating injustice.
Absolutely.
And that's not a win in the honest sense, if our goal is justice.
Right.
You might then argue that democracies are more likely to curb against or curb injustice somehow in some way. And that's, true. You can have a debate about which form of government is more likely to more effectively curb the baser instincts of men.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I think this is the genius of the Founding Fathers. But they also understood this form of government that we have, the genius of it is in its abilities to curb against the baser instincts of men. It is not a silver bullet, and it doesn't save us from ourselves.
Right.
We still have to be people that seek justice and love truth, and are willing to seek righteousness, even when it requires self-sacrifice,
right,
or disempowerment of myself, or and all of that is very much in line with the Christian view of life in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting. If you look historically, there's kind of two main avenues of civilization advancing, right? One is through the government and one is through the church. And church missionaries, historically, have been great advocates for refining civilization, right? For taking
civilization being the key word.
Correct.
And this can't, so often it's thrown away as, we've got a bucket of all the bad things that we don't like anymore. Colonialism,
right,
Western civilization, cultural imposition, nation building. What we all should be able to agree on is that justice is a thing. It's real. Right. We want it, right? We say that.
Sure.
Well, what does that look like? That ideally means civilization, a place where people are free to live in harmony with one another and people's rights are duly respected.
Right. The fact that we're not seeing the fact that, again, we can all agree that there are things based off natural law that are objectively true and objectively wrong. Child marriage, objectively wrong. Genital mutilation, objectively wrong. Right. Like these practices that are
widow burning.
Yeah, absolutely. Famous example.
We
from
don't
India.
like that.
Yeah. Well, this is what we do here. Well, in my country, we hang people who do this, right?
Is that a mark of honoring people in their innate dignity, or is it an example of Western imposition?
Correct. Yep. And unfortunately, the left today says, well, that's colonial imposition, and you need to let people do what they believe is right, in all times and in all places, unless you happen to disagree with my personal view on something, and then we can't have that. Right. So it's this relativism that really isn't rooted and grounded in anything. It's the thought is the more I can defer to someone else, the better off I am and the more just of a person I am, as opposed to calling people to do what is right and what is good and what is true. Fortunately, that's the moral bankruptcy that we see on the other side of the aisle 9 times out of 10.
And you don't want to run around and act like I am king of the world and I'm going to go to war to impose my understanding of what is right on the rest of the world. But we shouldn't pretend that we aren't invested in pursuing justice and righteousness.
Oh, absolutely. I think the way we do aid, and we talked about this already in season 2, is fundamentally flawed, right? But if you're sending a country, $20 million worth of goods, and the gross national product of this country is, $100 million, like that's a serious amount of influence that you can wield in the development of this country, right? And there's no reason. Now, I would disagree with where our government is on most of these things today, and I'd say on most 9 out of 10 cases, the government is doing a horrible job of showing what is good, true, and beautiful, and promoting those things. But to say, look, if you have a practice in your country that's horrific, that's child marriage or something like that, that's injuring people, that's restricting legitimate freedom and imposing or impeding on natural rights, we're going to withhold this aid until you fix this. There's no reason we can't do that. There's no reason we shouldn't do that. That's a right way to use your diplomacy, because diplomacy in war have the same end goal, right? It's coercion. Are you coercing by force, or are you coercing by that nice saddle up next to you and say, hey, why don't you come over here and do this thing, right? And it
could be influence.
Yeah, absolutely.
A nicer word for it.
Yeah.
Well, and even then, coercion is a tool.
Correct.
It's a means, but what is the end?
Right.
And where the end is foggy, you see complete breakdown and political division. I wish we had more resolve and shared a shared understanding as Americans that we have a duty that we bear as Americans to our fellow Americans, to our country, and if nothing else, even if we can't agree on the specifics of a foreign war, and we can agree with Washington, be vigilantly guarded against getting entangled in foreign conflicts, because our primary interest and our primary area of influence is our own country.
Yep.
And we are held accountable most for that which we actually can control and actually are involved with.
Absolutely.
But that would also mean that when an American is on the line in harm's way, anywhere around the world, that should be a deeply unifying thing for all Americans to be able to say, this is a very clear instance of we do whatever it takes to protect our fellow Americans.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have to have the resolve to actually win, right? And we have to have a clear mission of what we're going in to do. Yeah, I think a great example of that going poorly was the original Iran hostage crisis when President Carter sent a rescue team in, and they ended up crashing in the desert, and they ended up having to abort the mission, and it was a really bad situation, and it basically showed our enemies that we can't execute on our threats, right? And we really haven't practiced any kind of serious hostage rescues since that failed attempt, because nobody wants to be that guy with egg on their face at the end of the day. But if you can't, one, you should be able to execute. Two, you should have a plan that has enough leeway in it to be able to figure out an alternative to still accomplish your mission. But there's got to be more of that, right? Because otherwise, what's the real threat? There is none, right? I think a great example of this done rightly was in the Eisenhower administration, when was it Alabama wouldn't integrate the schools, and the governor brought up the National Guard, and what did Eisenhower do? He sent in the 101st Airborne, right? Like there is a way to say I am in the right, I am more powerful than you, and if you don't do what I say, I'm going to hurt you, because what I'm telling you to do is, again, objectively true and right, and you don't mess with my people. So I'm not saying we need to send the 101st Airborne in every time there's a little problem somewhere. But if you don't have that level of deterrence based off of executing well on past actions, then you really don't have a place to negotiate from, right?
Right. And yet, failure will inevitably happen.
It will.
And what do you have to fall back on then? You don't only do the right thing because you think it'll work.
Correct.
There is a level at which you continually pursue the path that is right because it is right.
Yeah. I think a good example of that is Israel's response to the Munich Olympics back in the 70s when a terrorist group out of West Germany partnered with some Palestinians, and they killed a bunch of Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics. And I think I said that backwards, from East Germany. Anyway, German terrorists and Palestinian terrorists got together, killed a bunch of Jews. And Golda Meir, who was prime minister at the time, launched what was called Operation Wrath of God. And they systematically tracked, hunted down, and killed every single member of that terrorist group that was involved in the plotting, planning, and execution of those attacks.
Right.
Over the course of years, right? Like this guy would go to answer a phone and his phone would blow up. This guy would be sitting on the corner drinking a cup of coffee at a cafe, and two Israeli special forces guys would show up on a Vespa, shoot him 3 times in the head with a little small caliber pistol, and ride off. Like, that's the type of stuff that you do to say, we are not to be messed with. We will find you, we will hunt you down, and we will protect our citizens at all costs. They didn't go into some war, they didn't invade some country. They were disciplined, they were well trained, and they executed perfectly. And I think that's a position that the United States needs to start to take in order to have a greater influence in the world and to produce safety, right? Like, that's Reagan's whole thing, was peace through strength, right? We are going to keep the world in order and in check because they know that we can throw the hammer down anytime we need to. And we're not there today. Our readiness is not where it should be. Our skill level is not where it should be. Our recruiting of military personnel is not where it should be. And that's kind of indicative. There you go. Thank you. Of our culture as a whole, of being very soft and being very complacent. So
it also speaks to the narratives that we are buying into.
Yes.
And that our leaders are perpetuating. Again,
Absolutely.
The PR game that we're playing, do we want to be perceived as a nation that never hurts anybody, anytime, anywhere? Because that makes our leaders feel better about themselves.
Right.
And it's
a misplaced sense of accomplishment.
Like, you have a job.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very difficult job. It's a messy job. We live in a fallen world. We don't get to choose the non-messy road.
Right.
Like, the road is messy. All that we can try to do is fulfill our duty.
That's why you elect these people to be your representative, because it is messy and it is hard, and you need somebody that's going to make those decisions.
Right. And just like the Christian life, too often we think of this as like it's going to be spotless and perfect and blemishless. No. We make mistakes all the time.
Right.
But you know what is our saving grace at the end of the day? That through it all we serve the true King, King Jesus, and we seek his will, and we seek to always honor his commands and our duty in light of our heavenly citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing, or at least a corresponding picture of this in our earthly duties. We have vocations to our family, to our fellow citizens, to our countrymen, and even as members of the state, the political sphere.
Mm-hmm.
We have a duty to protect the lives of our people, and we need to take that very seriously. And if at the end of the day, people are going to skewer you because you were too too vigilant in upholding your duty and maintaining the lives and the liberties of your fellow citizens, well, that was the oath that you took.
Mm-hmm. And there's a right way and a wrong way to do that, right? Like I think it was the 95 crime bill, the crime bill from the 90s. Set some horrible precedents and some horrible standards that have been used to miscarry justice horrifically since they were enacted. But then you look at somebody like Tim Walz, right? Governor of Minnesota. The George Floyd incident happened, rioters in the streets, burning down police precincts, and the inaction out of the governor's office was staggering, right? And so if this guy can't get his act together enough to protect the people of his state, how then should we why then should we trust him to protect us as a nation if he's already failed to do that in a more local level, right? This doesn't mean that you create these standards like in the crime bill where you're just going after everybody and there's no opportunities for judges to actually look at the law and look at the situation and decide wisely, which is what they're charged to do. But to let crime run rampant like that is a direct indication of the type of foreign policy that we're going to see and the type of inaction that we're going to see in an administration that's represented by those people.
It's easy for a politician to say, I want to be a leader to all Americans. I want to be a leader to all my people. But then you look at the record, and the minute we start playing PR games and buying into some narrative where we apply justice selectively. Selective justice is not justice at all.
Correct.
And we've just lost the thread.
Yep. Would you agree with the adage, justice delayed is justice denied?
Well, it depends on how delayed it is.
Sure.
All justice is a little delayed.
True.
If nothing else, the ultimate justice, I'm trusting in the return of Christ and the recreation of the world, and I know it will be made right then, and I'm willing to wait.
Right.
But it does require faith.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the hope that we live with,
Right.
right? Knowing that all things will be corrected, all injustice will be undone, every tear will be wiped away when all is said and done, because God is able. And even as we're thinking through hostage situations, what is the ultimate hostage saving story? It's the story of the gospel, right? Yeah. Christ freeing the hostages from Satan's grasp.
That's a great illustration, but you're right on the line of being a Baptist pastor with that analogy. That was very, very close. Those DTS roots are hard to get away from.
Well, you even look at Israel when they're in slavery in Egypt, right?
Absolutely.
And what does God do? He sends his prophet to tell Pharaoh, "Let my people go," so that they can go into the wilderness and worship me.
And then what did he do? When he didn't let them go, he sent plagues.
Right. And he dropped the hammer.
Yep.
Very hard. Mm-hmm. But God, it's the God that would go. He leaves the 99 to go after the one. Mm-hmm. We get to. Well, we have to. We're in this very messy, very broken world, where we're frequently faced with these dilemmas of how much are we willing to give and to fight and to sacrifice to go after the one that is in harm's way.
Right.
And we face that dilemma constantly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'll quote the late, great Southern philosopher Toby Keith, who said, "It's time for the long arm of the law to put a few more in the ground." And we tend to react to that. Some people, like me, lean into it and say, yes, absolutely. And then some people are like, oh, no, you can't do that. That's too far. That's too extreme. It's too much. But if you understand where justice comes from, that justice is a responsibility that government has that's been given by God. When God instituted government, that is what it was for. It was to restrain evil and punish evildoers. And to not do that is to flee from your right responsibility and your right role. Now, that doesn't mean you're sadistic about it. It doesn't mean that you celebrate it and you're excited about the loss of a human life or anything like that. But when justice is carried out, we should have a sense of pride, a sense of relish that this evil is no longer being able to be perpetrated on the world. That's the issue with Hamas in Israel, right?
Yeah.
Hamas' sole reason for existence is to wipe Israel off the map. If Hamas put all of their guns down today, there would be peace. If Israel put all of its guns down today, there would be mass slaughter. Like, that's the reality of the situation. That is the clash of civilizations. And that is why we need to keep Israel in check, and we need to keep them from committing war crimes, absolutely. But at the same time, we need to allow them to fight this fight, and we need to allow them to win and stay out of their way and support them when they can. Because, again, a weakened terrorist organization is good for the United States, right? It is good for us here. It keeps the fight there. And we'll always face those issues. We'll always face that danger of a threat and that danger of terrorism. We can't get out of it today. With our porous southern border and the fact that the world is flat, it's always going to be with us. And we have to have the resolve to say, that doesn't matter. I'm going to stand up for my family. I'm going to stand up for what is, again, good, true, and beautiful. And we're gonna have justice, and justice will be carried out.
If there's nothing else that Americans should be able to agree on, it's that the fight for civilization globally simply means fighting for people to be able to speak freely and to pursue the good freely. Mm-hmm. That requires us to live in civility and relative peace with one another. Mm-hmm. And then we have to be willing to honor one another's voices at the end of the day, right? Like, this is the general premise behind the American experiment, this general impulse towards democracy and Republican government, constitutionalism. It's a desire to set people up in a position to manage the hardest parts of the human experience and all these conflicts in relative peace. Otherwise, you are left with terrorism and tribalism, and the very worst expressions of human history just playing themselves out across generations.
Yeah, that was the core of Eisenhower's D-Day address, right? The hopes of freedom-loving people everywhere are with you. right? Like we as a superpower have that responsibility to allow freedom to flourish and to restrain evil. And there are many ways that we can do it that don't require us to commit thousands of American men to a combat zone halfway across the world in a country we've never heard of. But sometimes that's what it requires. And when it does, it needs to be very specific, it needs to be limited, and it needs to be measured in, out, and done.
Yeah. In our liturgy every week, we pray for Christian rulers in whatever context, whether they're kings or democratically elected presidents, and we pray that Christian societies would punish wickedness and vice and uphold true virtue and religion, which is just another way of saying that governments that focus on anything else, right? There's so many ways you can mess this up. You have a government that, to go back to the Toby Keith thing, the government that doesn't put enough of the guilty, the wicked in the ground. Well, why aren't they doing that? It's because they're doing something else. And that's where government has become corrupted, and they got in bed with bad actors. And the tools of justice that this society has, instituted by God, are being turned against the innocent.
Right. Yes.
We don't want that. And so we have to be aware of the ditches on both sides of the road. And generally they come from the same heart, which is a government that's not focused on its God-ordained authority to uphold all that is true, good, and beautiful, to seek justice first, to hunger and yearn after the righteousness of God, the protection of the innocent, the downtrodden, and to confront the very real evil in this world on behalf of those who cannot confront it themselves. That's why we have government. The more government fails to uphold that primary duty, the more impulses you see in society for people to take upon themselves that kind of agency. You get vigilante justice, you get terrorism, you get mass bombings in public places, and you see the creation of a living hell. And sadly, that's very much what a lot of the Middle East, this conflict in Gaza, that's what it is today.
Yep.
And that should grieve all of us. But the solution is, it's not going to be in buying into this really cheap and easy narrative of this one group is all good, this other group is all bad. Israel doesn't have a right to exist. It's messy. There's very little that we can actually concretely accomplish as Americans on the other side of an ocean. But we can look out for our own people, and we should be vigilant in upholding our oath to protect our fellow Americans. And we should use all the tools at our disposal to try to push the needle towards justice at the end of the day.
Yes.
Around the world. And we can try to do that with a sense of realism, knowing that there are a lot of things outside of our control, but there are a few things that are in our control. And we have to be super mindful of that. So if this was more of a shared understanding among Americans, I think we'd be better at holding our elected representatives accountable to doing the few things that they can control and do them well, rather than constantly passing the buck, constantly seeking other goals. Seems like we're constantly chasing after things that we can't really achieve and can't really control, and we ignore the basic things that we have well within our power. And who suffers at the end of the day more than anybody else are the people who can't protect themselves, the innocent, the voiceless. Those are the ones who get ignored when government takes its eye off the ball of justice.
Absolutely. I think that's a great way to kind of wrap us up today. I think this has been a great conversation. It's been good for me to kind of work through it as we've talked, but this has been great. Big thanks again to our sponsor, Stand for Georgia Values Action. They have a brand new website, new URL, same great content. It's gavalues.org. We'd love for you to check them out and support their work. I believe they're going to be having an event coming up on October 3rd. More details to follow on that, but we could not do what we do without them. So again, a huge thank you to our sponsor, Stand for Georgia Values. You can find them on Facebook, Twitter, etc. Go give them a follow. They put out some good content And yeah, they've been a wonderful partner to us. But Spencer, thanks again for the time today. Looking forward
Thank
to
you,
doing
Bryce.
it again next week. Hey, everybody, this is Bryce Futch, host and creator of the Way Forward podcast. And I wanted to take a minute and tell you about our sponsor for season 2, Stand for Georgia Values Political Action Committee. They exist to ensure that every vote in Georgia is an informed vote, providing clear, concise, and accurate information about the issues and candidates shaping our future. They do some incredible work finding phenomenal candidates at a local level throughout North Georgia, and then also doing some work across the state as well. But you can find out more information about them at standforgeorgiavaluespac.com. We're incredibly grateful to have them as a sponsor. Like I said, not only have they sponsored season 2, but they're going to continue to sponsor the podcast moving forward. So hopefully you'll be getting some more regular content from us. Be on the lookout for that next month. We're very excited for what is to come on the way forward. Full disclosure, I do serve as their executive director of that organization and their partnered 501c3 Stand for Georgia Values Foundation. But thanks again to Stand for Georgia Values PAC for their sponsorship. Please check out their website and be involved with them so that they can continue to support the work that we do here at The Way Forward. Thanks for listening.